Hello again, everyone. So we've looked at resource dependency theory and how this relates to strategic partnerships in recreation and parks. And then with this second topic this week, we follow a similar format by considering first here the ideas of innovation and diffusion, which provides relevant context from which to then discuss information technology and its increasingly prominent role in the field of recreation and parks. I'm going to start with the concept of strategic innovation, which I'm pulling from an article by Charitou and Markides that you can find on Canvas. And in this article, the authors suggest that strategic innovation is when an organization changes its business model through innovation to a new way of playing the game. And the light bulb on this slide is quite symbolic because it represents that spark, that idea that offers new ways of potentially working. And the first topic we will look at in this module on innovation in sport is digital technology, which is an excellent example of sport organizations embracing a new way of playing the game, especially in terms of how they interface with their participants and customers. On the previous slide, I discussed strategic innovation, and a subtle variation on strategic innovation is disruptive strategic innovation, which Charitou and Markides describe as when that new way of playing the game is both different from and in conflict with the traditional way. And the authors discuss grocery like home delivery services as a perfect example because such services challenge the existing business model by sort of rendering the brick and mortar grocery store as somewhat obsolete. And as we'll discuss in this module on innovation in sport, data analytics is a disruptive strategic innovation that has put pressure on sport organizations not only to adopt a new way of playing the game, but a new way that is in conflict with how business has been conducted historically. Charitou and Markides go on to suggest that when faced by a disruptive strategic innovation, organizations tend to respond in one of four categories of responses. These responses are determined concurrently by the ability and motivation to respond. For example, if organizations have the ability to respond but lack the motivation, they either focus on their own business or ignore the innovation altogether. Now, I'm sure you can think of examples where potentially disruptive innovations were on your organization's radar, and in these situations, how did the organization respond, and can you fit this into the matrix as presented by Charitou and Markides? In another article that I posted to Canvas, Klein and Knight discuss innovation implementation. The authors claim there are 6 common stumbling blocks that act to prevent diffusion and innovation implementation. For example, many innovations require would-be users to acquire new technical knowledge and skills. You can picture how this stumbling block relates directly to IT diffusion, or potentially a lack thereof, as new hardware and software combinations require employees within an organization to develop new skills. So how are those employees prepared and motivated for that need to develop those new knowledge bases and skills? Quite a lot of these stumbling blocks are of course interdependent. As an example, innovation implementation is time consuming because of the need to address the knowledge and skill deficiencies of staff through various training programs. And you will address these stumbling blocks in the second part of this week's case study as you develop a plan to implement your preferred option. Klein and Knight also discuss certain antecedents or conditions that best enable effective diffusion of innovative technology. For example, organizations need financial resources to invest in training and to mitigate any drag in performance or output in the transition period. In addition, organizations require a learning orientation, so a culture that embraces new opportunities and practices. Sort of takes us all the way back to that idea of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and how this mentality can be stifling and it can serve to suppress diffusion, in particular of technology and information technology. The diffusion of innovation theory refers to the process that occurs as people adopt a new idea, product, practice, philosophy, and so on. Everett Rogers was responsible for popularizing this theory in the 1960s and 70s. And within this theory, there are 5 categories of adopters of an innovation. You have innovators, and they're characterized, by those who want to be the first to try the innovation. Early adopters are characterized by those who are comfortable with change and adopting new ideas. The early majority are those who adopt new innovations before the average person. However, they do need evidence that the innovation works before this category of people will adopt the innovation. The late majority, characterized by those who are skeptical of change and will only adopt an innovation after it's been generally accepted and adopted by the majority of the population. And then there's laggards, okay? They're characterized by those who are very traditional and conservative. They're the last to make the changeover to new technologies. And this category is often the hardest to appeal to. And as you can see, within any given innovation, the early majority and late majority represent the largest adopter categories in this sort of bell curve. And then in between each of those categories is the critical mass. Think about yourself and how you've adopted new innovations or ideas and where you fit. In the example before about grocery delivery service, I must admit, we as a family jumped on this quite early in the US, but this was largely because those sort of services diffused much earlier in the UK, which raises another important point that diffusion is not necessarily a global phenomenon and can be national, regional, and even local in scope. In addition to adopter categories, the diffusion process, the S-curve, shows the innovation from its slow early beginnings as the technology or process is developed to an acceleration phase, so a steeper line, and as it matures, and then finally to its stabilization over time, which is the flattening of the curve and where the diffusion process reaches saturation point. So just to recap, this recording has provided some theoretical foundations from which to now discuss and understand how information technology has diffused across the recreation and parks field, and that's what we'll consider in the second recording.